When a little boy found himself lost in the African bush, he felt utterly alone and terrified. As a lion approached, he feared his end was near. But then the unthinkable happened, and the crying boy embarked on an adventure few would believe. Ethan was on holiday in Africa with his family when he decided to wander off into the nearby bush, driven by an innocent sense of adventure. Soon he realized he was lost in the middle of nowhere. Fear gripped him, and what happened next only intensified his fright. Ethan stopped and tried to get his bearings. He couldn't believe he'd wandered off from the campsite. Desperately hoping to spot the camp, he climbed halfway up a tree for a better view. But what he saw made his stomach churn. Just a few meters away, a lion crouched, staring right at him. It had likely been stalking him all along. Faced with a dreadful decision, Ethan knew he had to act. Staying in the tree seemed relatively safe, but also made him a target for other predators. So he decided to make a run for it, hoping the lion would lose interest. Naive but terrified, Ethan prepared himself. Slowly, he climbed down, ready to sprint the moment his feet touched the ground. The second he landed, he bolted in the opposite direction, running faster than ever, trying to navigate the dense foliage without making too much noise. He dared to glance back, praying not to see the lion, but there it was right behind him, pounding after him. That's when Ethan realized he had made a terrible mistake. The lion was gaining on him, and he was sure he'd be pinned down any moment. Desperately praying for a miracle, he kept running as fast as he could. But then tragedy struck. He remembered glancing back one more time to see how close the lion was, and then his face hit the ground. Pain exploded in his ankle, and his nose gushed blood. He screamed in agony, momentarily forgetting about the lion. Looking around, he saw he had stepped right into a badger hole in his haste to escape. The impact had been awkward and excruciating, breaking his ankle. He had never felt such severe pain in his life. Overwhelmed, he cried out, wishing for his mother's comfort. Instead, he got a different kind of comfort. Bent over in pain, tears streaming down his face, Ethan suddenly felt a warm, wet sensation on his cheek. He opened his eyes in shock to find the lioness he'd been running from, now gently licking his face. She looked less like a predator and more like a big, curious cat. Ethan froze, terrified she might bite his face off. But she kept licking him, then nudged his face hard. This startled Ethan back to reality, giving him the adrenaline to move again. Slowly he shifted away from the affectionate lioness, utterly confused. Back at camp, the park rangers had warned against interacting with wild animals. Now faced with this strange behavior, Ethan didn't know what to do. His ankle throbbed terribly, clouding his thoughts. He knew he needed to get back to camp and his family, but how could he move with his injury? He had to focus on the immediate threat, the lioness. If she turned on him, he wouldn't stand a chance. So he watched her closely, trying to predict her next move. She paced slowly in front of him, occasionally stopping to look at him before resuming her pacing. Ethan didn't know what to think. When he tried to shift his position, she was right next to him again, nudging and licking him, terrifying him to his core. Her actions seemed affectionate, but why? Was she playing with him before making him a meal? Quietly sobbing from the pain, Ethan struggled to focus on anything else. This was unlike any pain he had ever experienced. He tried desperately to think of a way out, but the pain was all-consuming. The big cat seemed to sense Ethan's intense pain because she eventually stopped pacing and sat right against him, as if trying to offer comfort. Ethan recoiled in fear, but she persisted, nudging him gently in an upward motion. When he resisted, she nudged him harder before walking a few feet away and looking back at him. When Ethan didn't react, she repeated the gesture, nudging him again, and then looking back over her shoulder. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she wanted him to follow her. Was that really it, or was he starting to lose his mind in the savannah? Frustrated by his stillness, the lioness pawed at the ground and let out a snappy roar, sending a gust of sand and dust flying around Ethan. He coughed and realized how parched he was. He couldn't remember the last time he had something to drink, and now his thirst was overwhelming. The pain in his ankle and his growing thirst made it clear he needed to move, no matter how painful. He decided to trust his instincts. Maybe the lion was trying to help him, and following her seemed better than staying put and risking other predators. Painfully, he hobbled to his feet and began to follow her. Her ears perked up when she realized he was accepting her silent invitation. She was leading him somewhere, but where? Worry began to creep in. Was he wrong about her intentions? Was she leading him to danger? His anxiety peaked as they broke out of the dense bush and came to a fresh, running river. Hearing the flowing water, everything else melted away. All he could think about was quenching his thirst. With great difficulty he lowered himself to the ground and drank. The water felt like the greatest gift, and he drank greedily, finally quenching his thirst. As he panted with relief, he remembered the lion. He was in the most vulnerable position, back turned to her. Whipping around, he saw her sitting quietly behind him, as if guarding him. She didn't look like she was about to attack, so he laid back, utterly relieved. The fresh water revived Ethan a bit, and a small part of him dared to hope he might survive. He just needed a few minutes to rest. Then he thought he heard his name. His eyes shot open, and he sat up, looking around. Seeing no one, he was about to close his eyes again when he heard it once more. Sitting up as fast as he could, he strained to listen. Distant shouts floated through the air. The lioness had heard them too, perking up and looking anxious. She let out a low growl as if to ward off the approaching people. Ethan wasn't about to let his chance for rescue slip by. Taking a deep breath, he began screaming for help. He shouted repeatedly, calling for help and waving his arms high in the air, hoping someone would see or hear him. The lioness grew increasingly agitated, worried about the people approaching. Ethan realized she had it all wrong. What she saw as a threat was actually his salvation. The voices grew louder and closer. Ethan turned toward them, shouting, knowing they were following his voice. But the lioness became more aggressive, trying to push him away from the approaching people. She headbutted him hard, knocking him over twice, trying to push him in the opposite direction, as if urging him to escape. Ethan refused to move, and just as he heard his father's voice, tears filled his eyes, and he shouted for his dad. As the footsteps quickened in the bush, the lioness, seeing this as a threat, put herself in front of Ethan, pushing with all her weight. He fell but got back up, driven by the adrenaline of imminent rescue. The lioness bit his shirt, dragging him away from the voices. Ethan wriggled and yelled, trying to get free. At that moment, his father and the game rangers broke through the brush. Seeing his son in the lion's grasp was too much for Ethan's father. He grabbed the ranger's gun, trying to shoot the lion. The rangers quickly took control, understanding his concern but not wanting to risk harming Ethan. The sound of the gunshot startled the lioness, causing her to release Ethan's shirt. Instead of running, she positioned herself between him and the search party, baring her teeth. Despite everything, she still thought she was protecting Ethan from the other humans. The game rangers felt threatened and knew they needed to de-escalate the situation before it became even more dangerous for the child. They took a defensive stance, ready to deal with the lion, but then something incredible happened. Ethan hobbled past the lioness and wrapped his arms around her head, sobbing and begging the game rangers not to hurt her. The lion responded by cuddling into his embrace, as if understanding his protection. The game rangers were stunned. This was beyond anything they had ever seen. Slowly they lowered their weapons. Ethan's father rushed forward, scooping him into his arms, ignoring the threat of the lion by his side. The lion let out a low moan, almost acknowledging that the man was there to care for the boy too. With Ethan in his arms, his father began to slowly carry him away. The game rangers followed cautiously, keeping a close eye on the lioness. Surprisingly, she stayed with them, determined to ensure that they didn't harm Ethan. She followed them all the way back to camp. When Ethan's mother saw him, she burst into tears and rushed him to their tent for much-needed love and care. Since they were deep in the savannah, it took almost 24 hours before Ethan could see a doctor. Thankfully, his ankle wasn't seriously broken. They were able to set it and give him medication for the pain. To Ethan, everything was a blur. He passed out in his father's arms right after being rescued and remained semi-conscious for most of the time. When he finally came to, he had many questions, the main one being about the lioness. The game rangers took him to the camp's border, where the lioness had stayed the entire time. They told Ethan that, despite their efforts to chase her away, she kept returning for him. Ethan took a moment to thank the lioness, finally understanding that she had done everything in her power to keep him safe. Back at camp, he sat with his parents and recounted the story of how he had followed a guinea fowl until he was lost. Stuck in the middle of nowhere, desperate for help, he had found it in the most unlikely place. His parents listened in disbelief and horror, but were immensely grateful he had survived. It was a story Ethan would tell for the rest of his life. An incredible tale of survival and unexpected friendship. How would you react if a lion chased you? Could you trust a predator to help you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.